Hello and welcome back to A Better World. This is your host, Mitchell J. Rabin, and we're very glad you're joining us again today. Today we are with the author of this book, You Can Change the World, Dr. Ervin Laszlo. He is Hungarian-born and is internationally known for his work in systems theory. He's written many, many books, dozens in fact. He has consulted to governments, prime ministers, the United Nations. Everywhere there are troubles where people need to see straighter and understand more from a systemic point of view what it is that's going on. Well, this has led him to a very in-depth study of the environment and social systems, and that is very much the subject of this book, as well as an idea and a prompting of what we as individuals, we down on the ground, can do to make this world a better place, and in fact, not just a better place, but quickly. So we're very glad to have you as a guest today, Dr. Laszlo.
It's very nice to be here.
Good, glad to have you. So I know what inspired the book because of your deep feeling about what's going on this planet. What are some of the statistics? I think that could help to awaken people a bit. What are the actual statistics of where we are sitting on the precipice today of really environmental and social collapse?
Well, on the one hand, we have a social and economic division in the world, which is not sustainable, because more and more people are being pressed into really abject poverty. We now estimate that about half of the world population, just about 3 billion people, are living on less than $5 a day, and about 1.5 billion perhaps on $1, but these statistics are not very reliable. It could be very much more also, and perhaps,
yes,
perhaps even less, but likely to be optimistic at this point. The spread of inequality in the world is enormous, and of course it's highly visible because wealth and power is distributed, it's all over the world. It's just not distributed evenly, but it's spread everywhere.
Right.
So on the one hand, you have these enormous problems of how people have access to resources and have access to wealth and can live or just survive and vegetate.
What do economists say about this? I mean, they see the disparity and they're spinning off theories of world growth and the like all day long. I mean, is there not any consensus among them that suggests that the so-called global market system as is isn't really functional?
Well, it depends on whom you ask. It is, of course, economists of the classical schools, even called neoclassical economics, would trust to the market system. Sometimes called this is market fundamentalism. You believe that the market system will cure all ills. Eventually, it will spread the wealth, and everybody will be better off. All you have to do is play the market. Now, other people point out that the market system, the market itself works, but works only when what is known as the playing field is level. Or in other words, everybody has the same chances, more or less, to enter on the market. When some people, to use a mixed simile, own all the chips,
yes,
and others have very few, then those who have the great majority of the chips, when they play the market, they are likely to end up the winners, much more so than the others. So the rich get richer and the poor get children, and that is still the
My
case.
mother raised me on that phrase. Yeah.
That is still the case by and large in the world.
Yeah.
And the hope is a pious hope that if you just become wealthier, eventually wealth will trickle down. But it doesn't trickle for a number of reasons, also because poverty is self-reproducing. It's sort of people are locked into a vicious cycle.
Right.
They don't have access to any resources, they can't help themselves, and they just try to survive from day to day. Of course, they're overwhelming also their immediate environment. They are deforesting the cities and these giant cities in the third world, and overloading the carrying capacity of the lands, also polluting a great deal. It's not their fault. I mean, this is just happening because there's no alternative. Of course, they pollute per capita, per person, a lot less than the rich people, or so-called rich people.
Right,
but still, as long as we have 20% of the world's population having 86% of the consumption.
That's right. Now, just to go back to the economist's view for a second, economics is considered a social science. And based on what you just shared with us, it shows that the current systems, as they're operating, are dysfunctional. They're not working. And so, from a scientific basis, they've actually got the evidence of the dysfunction. So we've gone from theory of free market enterprise and maybe slight regulations or a playing field flat and even to this current state of affairs. Isn't this enough and ample evidence to show, to disprove the validity of those theories?
Not really, because as the saying goes, statistics can be made to support anything, especially statisticians, as they say. But the fact is that you can play around with numbers. You can show that education is making inroads, that actually people are spending more, are saving more. There are all kinds of ways you can package this.
I see.
But the fact
you can
is,
find the silver lining.
Yes.
Even
the
in the
fact
current
is that
situation.
the world population is growing. You see. Now, if it wouldn't be growing, there would be a different kind of a ball game. You could probably then hope that gradually, as higher levels of education come in, higher life styles and quality of life will come about. But as it is, it's growing, and the growth occurs primarily in the poor parts of the world. It's still growing not quite, but near 90 million persons a year are added to the world population. And that's quite a size.
Efforts relative to world population control having any kind of measurable effect?
Well, classical modes of controls don't work, and they are very arbitrary and very dictatorial, telling people that they can't have more than a certain number of children, or trying to sterilize people, etc. Those simply don't work. The only way that can work is by raising the level of education of people, raising social security, so that, for example, families will not be needing large numbers of offspring in their old age to support them, or not be needing even during their adult life to support them by working on the farm. So all these kind of persons are actually producing an effect, a backlash. So that right now we can expect that poverty is self-generating to some extent. You just simply don't reach the poorest segment. Now there are exceptions, of course. There are ways and means of reaching the poor populations. The best example for that is the so-called microcredits. When people who don't qualify for any kind of a credit are getting small amounts. 70, 80, 100, $120. A whole group is usually designated as being responsible for each other, so they don't offer any guarantee, any collateral, but they have each other's word that they're going to do something. And these people then buy a cow, set up a little stand on the street, do something, that they had an idea, buy a sewing machine.
Create productivity of some sort.
Engage in some kind of economic activity.
Yes.
And the success of this movement has been phenomenal. The repayment rate is higher in the microcredits than in the commercial credits by the banks.
Really?
So it shows if you trust people to do something, to pull themselves up by the bootstraps, if you give them the means, they'll do so.
Yes.
And you don't operate on the standard market system, basically. You have to start the process.
Yes, exactly. Now, from an environmental point of view, what do you see and what can we do?
Well, environmentally, we know that the carrying capacity of the planet in terms of its biological productivity, in terms of the lands and the fisheries and then the seas, all this, what is being produced on the planet is being overloaded. In other words, we take out more from the planet than it can regenerate. The exact figures are available in the sense that we know what the so-called ecological footprint of an individual should be, 2.2 hectares per person, if people wouldn't consume more than they produce of 2.2 hectares from the productivity of the earth. Per year, yeah. And that's what they would be relying the productivity of that area, And then this productivity could regenerate, so that year after year people could draw on this much of the biological resources.
And that's based on the total world population
This is a
today.
total world population. In other words, you get the total productivity of the Earth and divide it by the total world population, then you get the per person, per capita, how much you can use, you know. Now, it turns out that the average is 2.8 hectares instead of 2.2, you know, almost a third higher. And the overcharge, basically the overshoot,
right,
is
the debt
is much greater than would appear, because we only get to this seemingly, it's still an overshoot, but still seemingly a modest figure of 2.8 hectares per person, because people in the poor countries are under 1 hectare. Bangladesh is a half a hectare.
I see.
So that we can have in the US the average footprint be 12.5 hectares, in Sweden being 6 hectares, in Germany 8 hectares, in Japan, etc., similar.
Right.
So the average is out to fairly low, but clearly you have at least 6 times of the use of the biological resources of the planet in the so-called rich countries than what would be sustainable.
So what, since this is real, this isn't like having your hand on the printing press for money and dealing with debt in that way. This is actual material that sustains life, or no longer sustains life. How long can this out of proportion scenario last before there's an actual dive?
Nobody knows, you see.
Can it be mathematically figured to some extent?
No, even mathematically cannot be figured, because we can work in probabilities. These systems are not deterministic, they're not mechanical. We don't know when it reaches the so-called tipping point, the point of collapse. We know that it's bound to reach it. But just how soon, we don't know, because we don't know when a relatively piecemeal wave of change is going to shift into a so-called abrupt mode, you know.
But if you hold all variables constant based on today's proportions, you could make, you know, granted, it's not a real number, but it would at least give some indications. And putting aside a moment the abrupt, you know, precipitous reality of a tipping point, even with things out of proportion as they are, I'd imagine that the future isn't all that far.
Well, we are already at a breakdown point. It's not breaking down on a global level, because there are an awful lot of vested interests, and they're all the time compensating, seemingly compensating, on the level of putting in more money, capital, applying newer technologies, and technologies can sometimes correct for things.
Yes, right.
It's sort of like somebody who has bad eyesight and is really glaucoma and something serious wrong with the eyes, and then keeps wearing eyeglasses, stronger and stronger eyeglasses, and says, well, look, I'm still seeing pretty well, so must be nothing wrong, you know. And at a given time comes when the eyeglasses
cash flow
won't
point
correct.
of view.
Yes,
Right.
won't correct anymore.
Yeah.
So we have already reached the point where it's non-sustainable. When it actually reaches the point where a global level of collapse comes, a kind of a chaotic situation, we don't know. Already we have global level of stress, the whole terrorism and war situation, and the fear and all that is actually a manifestation, a symptom of the stress in the system. If people would be less frustrated, feeling less marginalized, obviously they would not be ready to sacrifice their lives for what they consider to be a cause.
Right.
You know?
Sure. Well, in the talk that you gave yesterday that I attended at the UN at the Church Center, you made a point about what would it be to you were talking about what we can do essentially to individually correct the situation, and I was wondering if you would just address that.
Well, you see, we expect in the everyday logic that somebody is in charge, somebody will go to do the things that are necessary. They're used to that from childhood on. There's always a teacher.
The government is supposed
Then,
to do
yeah,
that.
when your child is a teacher, then your parents. When you grow up, then you think, oh, there is the state administration, there is the government. Or perhaps there are some people in business will know how to manifest, how to manage, after they're managers, you know. Somehow or other, the world will be kept going because somebody is taking care of it. Well, this belief turns out to be incorrect because nobody is actually in charge. Nobody even knows exactly what is to be done. Plus, the people who are really have a greater power, they also have the greater vested interests. So they are the least likely, aside from some people with really creativity and commitment and morality, you know, it exists. But on the whole, people of the most vested interest in maintaining the status quo are those who profit more from the present system. So therefore they fear actual change. They want to oppose change. Now they recognize. They recognize that change is inevitable, but they hope that they can keep control of the change, so they stay on top of the wave. Really systemic change of the kind, which is really becoming a new world, a kind of world which is truly sustainable and humane. It would have very different forces operating in it, and material possessions and money and the concentration of power and wealth would not be the main driving forces as they are now.
What would be those other forces you're referring to?
I think, you know, human nature is not necessarily so programmed from birth that we are only happy if we have more and more material possessions. In fact, there have been some studies made on the physiology of the brain recently which show that people with more material possessions actually are exposed to more stress. So the happiness factor is not really connected with how much you own. There is such a thing as the quality of life, which is not the same as the quantity of your material living standards. How much resources you use, how much energy you consume, etc., etc. It's a different kind of thing. You can have a very high quality of life with somewhat more modest consumption, more modest use, and more recycling, more ways of using that you regenerate the resources. That's entirely possible. And people who do that actually lead healthier lives, have a better quality of life. And many of the things that are really are beautiful, are satisfying in the world, money cannot buy, as they say. Money can buy resources.
Well, you know, I just came back from India, Dr. Laszlo, and I saw people who were working in the fields, and honestly, they don't have many rupees to their name. And I saw, not in all cases, but in many cases, enough to make mention of it, a sense of peace and a sense of ease with their lives that the Westerners that were walking around the same place did not possess.
Well, traditional.
And this is a fairly common experience that I've had in traveling in so-called third world countries, where not only, interestingly enough and ironically enough, are people at greater ease and they have a entirely different relationship to time, but they're also more generous than most people I know of the moneyed classes here in the United States.
Well, they have a different sense of living. It's a more longer term way of looking at the world, the way their forefathers have lived. This is the way they expect it to be. They are part of nature. They see the cycles of nature. Right. And human culture is somehow, something has a long perspective,
yes,
a longer
exactly.
perspective, a deeper root.
That's right.
And they believe that there's a spiritual dimension which is not necessarily about how much you eat. People will tell you in these poor countries, as I'm sure they told you, that you can only eat so much anyway in a day. you only need basically one good bed to sleep on, you know. Right. And why do you need all that? So it's not a question.
It's true.
It's not a question of sacrificing. My sense is not you're cutting back. You have to make do without. Right. What you make do without is superfluous. Those things we don't need.
What in the current situation, close to the tipping point, where we see that global patterns have already changed relative to weather? It's not a maybe, it's an already. What can the ordinary citizen do is there something he or she can do? And on what level can he or she participate in kind of taking control where our so-called leaders have not?
Well, the ordinary person is the key. This world is made up of ordinary persons. And
That's right.
the ordinary persons who live in the so-called rich part of the world have a choice. Whereas some of those people that you talked about, where they live in a traditional way, with a few rupees a day or whatever currency they use, they don't really have much choice. They have to do what they're doing to maintain themselves.
Right.
And they're in a way happy often doing that, unless they live in the big city slums and really an artificial environment that is depressed. But as long as they allow them to live traditional lifestyles, they're happy. But those of us who live in a world that is a so-called industrialized world, we have a choice. We can lead different kinds of lives. Now, it's a very simple test, very simple question each person can ask himself or herself. Is the way I live possible for all people on this earth? It's not as though everybody would have to lead the same kind of life, live the same way. But do I, for example, consume food in a way that literally would make it impossible to feed all people? Very simple example. If I find myself eating red meat at the level which is a typical consumption of red meat in America and in some parts of Western Europe and in Japan, which was vegetarian before and now is heavily meat-oriented now, if you have to do that, the amount of agricultural produce you would have to come up with worldwide to feed the cows would have to double. In other words, we need another planet the size of the Earth just to be able to feed all the cows, to be able to provide all people on Earth with that amount of meat. So it's simply not capable. That kind of diet you cannot maintain, you cannot spread to 6.5 billion people. Many of these things are like that, or material energy consumption, particularly on non-renewable materials and fossil energies, is such that if you attempted to say, could all people consume like that? You would say, no, the planet just isn't big enough for that.
But even if people did that, it seems to me that at this point, so-called pull in their waste, is that really going to be sufficient enough to tip the scale in the other direction? The large multinationals remain utterly and completely intact, even if 20 million. I mean, one thing that might get affected is the cattle industry. That would be a good thing. But is that going to be sufficient to literally save us from this tipping point, from this point of environmental collapse?
Well, Mitchell, first of all,
and psychological collapse.
I would say two things about this. First of all, this is not a question to ask even. One has to do one's duty. One lives in the present time on this earth, and you have to do the right thing.
Yes.
And if you do
so
the right
one lives with oneself
thing,
happily.
We have, whether it works or not, at least you did what you could. And this is the satisfaction you can draw from living.
Yes.
You cannot control these large processes. But the second thing is this. You have to recognize that ultimately the individual multiplied by a critical amount is what decides what businesses produce, what political systems decide on, because we do not have a top-down system, basically. Basically, we have a system that's in the economies that are driven by the consumer, by the demand, by the client. We have in the political systems that are driven by voters and popularity of the decision makers in most parts of the world, certainly in those parts of the world where we have real choice. So if we not only live the right way, I mean a responsible way, but we also communicate how we live, show to others, and provide an example. These examples can spread very fast.
Yes.
Examples, I mean, fashion in blue jeans spreads very fast.
Exactly.
It could also spread in responsible living. And in fact, there are indications, according to surveys, that in the US adult population, there may have been, about 10 years ago, 3 million people who live on this responsible way, the so-called cultural creatives, about
right.
10, 12 years ago, and now there are 49 million, if not more. So it's spreading, and it's spreading in Europe and in other parts of the world. We have to join that wave. Eventually, that will stabilize the system.
Yes.
There is no other way, because nobody can do it from above or from the outside.
Right.
People themselves must do it.
Do you suggest people be politically active in terms of, let's say, letter writing campaigns, or
There are many ways you can be active in your private
voting
life,
through the internet?
the way you live, in your communication. You communicate on the internet with your congressman, etc. You try, for example, suggesting a pledge of sustainability to be taken by your elected politicians, you know, that they would devote primary attention to questions of longer-term sustainability, locally and globally, you know. You can participate in becoming, for example, members of shareholder associations. With very little money, you can buy a couple of shares. You can then raise your voice in the
vote,
associations
exactly.
and vote.
Exactly.
And if enough people start doing that, you know, you can really have an influence. Many, many ways. You have the choice. You can do it. And if people start doing it, then this world will stabilize itself in a humane and peaceful way. And if people just pass the buck, then we'll head toward the Holocaust.
Well, thank you for your encouragement and support in the right direction.
Thank you very much for this conversation.
Absolutely, me too. Thanks. We've been speaking with the author of this book, the renowned Dr. Laszlo. And reading this will help to inspire you to do the right thing at this very important point in time. Thanks so much for joining us. This is your host, Mitchell J. Rabin, and we look forward to seeing you all next week.